In his book, The Four Loves, C.S. Lewis defined the three natural loves, affection, friendship, eros, and the one divine love, agape, or charity, which is that between God and man. Unlike eros, friendship is not necessary to the survival of mankind, but it is, Lewis believed, one of the things which give most value to survival. Its importance to Lewis and those who knew him is well known. Writing about him, Lewis's brother and closest friend, Warner, said, "Jack was a man with an outstanding gift for pastime with good company, for laughter and the love of friends. He had indeed a remarkable talent for friendship. It is this love which radiates warmth through all his books, and that to such an extent that even those who never met him regard him as a friend." In this last part of Through Joy and Beyond, we hear not so much what Lewis liked about some of his friends, but what they liked and remember about him. One of Lewis's closest friends and colleagues in the University of Oxford was Professor J.R.R. Tolkien, the author of The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings. Lewis was a tutor in Magdalen College when they met in 1926, and Tolkien moved on from being the professor of Anglo-Saxon to being the Merton Professor of English Literature. His chair was attached to Merton College, and he had rooms in this 12th century quad, which is one of the oldest in Europe. Professor Tolkien told me that even if Jack Lewis had never written a book, he would remain in his memory as one of the best men he had ever known. His daughter Priscilla and his eldest son, Father John Tolkien, invited me to tea at Priscilla's home in Oxford, where we talked about Jack Lewis. I don't know whether I ever told you that I have one of the few existing diaries of Jack Lewis, and he says in his diary that he first met your father in 1926. Was it sometime after that, or about that time that you first met him?
Well, I wouldn't remember when I first met him, but my memories are largely of Jack at the Kilns in Headington, because we went up there quite frequently in the summers.
So that would have been after 1930 when he moved?
Would have been after 1930. I would think it was in the early part of his time there. I think he hadn't been there very long, because I remember wandering round the thing and saying what he was going to do with it. Mm-hmm. And the quarry, the pool, hadn't very much been done to it then.
Yes. Mm-hmm. And who was living there?
Mrs. Moore.
Yes. You met Mrs. Moore?
Oh, yes, we met Mrs. Moore. She presided over tea.
Yes.
More than my sister's doing at the moment.
Yes.
Very presided.
That's a very good hint.
Mm-hmm. And she, you ate what you were told.
Yes.
And Jack always seemed slightly uncomfortable.
But tea always made him very comfortable, I think, itself.
Tea made him comfortable.
Yes.
And then we sort of settled down, and then we used to go around the estate. We went up a lot of times over the years. And this would be while I was still at school, away at school. So it'd be in the summer holidays.
Yes. And did you see him often after that?
Yes, quite frequently. We saw him. Of course, he became, when I came up to Oxford, he was one of my lecturers. And I also had him for my 21st birthday party, which was in my last year.
Really? Where did you hold the party?
The party was at home,
yes,
in Northmore Road. And I still have two visions of that party. One was him and Hugo Dyson and my father doing a charade of the vulgar boatman, and all singing out of tune, and also rowing out of thing. And the other was Dyson saying, "Jack, you're making a pig of yourself," because he was very fond of smoked salmon.
Prescott, you actually attended some of Jack's lectures.
Yes, I suppose, actually, he was almost at the height of his fame, or beginning to be at the height of his fame as a great scholar, as distinct perhaps from his theological fame when I was an undergraduate at Oxford. And his lectures were certainly enormously popular. And I think that I attended the whole course of his prolegomena to literature, where, as far as I remember, there used to be a vast audience, and one had to be there early to get a good place. It was like a great performance. Apart from the intrinsic interest of, and the splendid manner of delivery, I have a very personal reason for remembering one incident particularly well, in that on this particular lecture, and he was the sort of lecturer that did think of the needs of small people like ourselves, people who knew very little and who perhaps wanted to take down in manageable form the very considerable learning which he was putting over to us. And I can remember on this particular occasion, he was telling us in marvelously lucid, simplified form, the great names throughout the ages who had been important in developing theories of art and literature. And these great names like Aristotle and Milton and Dryden were rolling down through the examination schools because his voice, I seem to remember, was very splendid and carried very easily. And there was a pause, and finally he said, and lastly, we have the Tolkienian theory of subcreation. Now that really did puzzle me, because whereas I had read a little Aristotle and a little Dryden, I couldn't think what Tolkienian referred to, and was chewing my pen before writing a suitable note, when a friend of mine, of the same age as myself, that is, we'd reached the very advanced age of about 19, jogged me in the side and said with intense excitement, "He's talking about your father." I've always thought, and thought at the time even, that one was very fortunate to have been studying English at Oxford at that period, because it was full of such very great people, of whom C.S. Lewis obviously was one of the most outstanding.
One thing I found very, very interesting in Lewis's correspondence is that he knew very few young people. But when you were in Italy, I remember during the war, he was writing to his brother Warnie with great concern about your welfare. I think you must be one of the first young people that he took to his heart, almost like a son.
Yes, I think this was probably true, that we knew one another early enough to be friendly, as a sort of uncle, if you like, rather than anything to do with academic side.
Yes.
And so we never at any time behaved any different from somebody we knew rather well and liked. And so I don't think we ever talked particularly about anything that put him on edge or put one another on edge. And we found him interesting in lots of things, like young people, and he could talk to you. He could talk to anybody, anyway. It was that I remember, that part of it. It was after I came back. And he was very glad to know I was back.
Yes.
We'd seen a fair amount of one another during my Oxford time, because I attended the same course of lectures, the prolegomena ones, which were in its much earlier days than when Priscilla saw them, and they were equally popular. He'd always be very punctual.
There was a story, I think you told me one time, about something that happened close to St. Cross, was it?
Yeah, well, we talked about all sorts of things, and I used to talk to him a lot about botany. And as you know, he was always interested in anything that arose, and he'd want to follow it up. And he apparently didn't know that some plants had their male and their female characteristics on different plants, of which the yew is one. And at about that time of the year, I was home somewhere in March or thereabouts when they flower. And my father and I, we must have lived in St. Cross Road then, and my father and I were going for a walk. We met Jack coming in the opposite direction. And at the entrance to the drive down to Holywell Manor, there was Jack beating two yew bushes to find out which was male and female. And then when the male one gave out clouds of pollen, he said, "Got you!"
Right. Yeah.
And he saw us then.
I think you, John, enjoyed something that Prisca and I didn't have a chance to enjoy so much, and that is you were actually present at many of the Inkling meetings in The Bird and the Baby. Do you recall those?
I remember a few. They were at the back. The place has been done up very much since. It was always worth. You never knew who was coming in. I mean, Jack was, if he wasn't there, then it was a failure. But Jack was the center of the situation, and people dropped in. And conversation might be about anything. But always at a level of interest and intelligence and knowledge, too. And people talked across their subjects, you know. I mean, you would find people talking about things that you knew wasn't their subject. It didn't sort of talk shop very easily.
Jack, writing to his brother Warnie, said that when he and your father used to meet as early as 1931, before the Inklings really began to gather momentum, that they used to talk with such zest that some people thought they were probably drunk, you know. But a number of the Inklings have commented on Jack's booming voice. Do you remember that as being a very distinctive
Yes,
trait
I remember
of
it
his?
very distinctively. And hearing the voice before you saw the person.
Yes.
Yes, I can remember
Yes.
the voice much more clearly, I think, almost than any other aspect of him.
John, you told me that you did continue your friendship with him for many years.
Yes, it went right on through the time. We used to meet periodically when I was at home. Always called me Sir John.
Yes.
In a good medieval fashion. Not necessarily all the way through, but we met. Sir John, how are you? And the bow and all this kind of thing. But then parents moved to Headington, and I didn't see very much of them because, of course, Lewis was so ill for over quite a long period. But I remember the last time we saw him, my father expressed a wish to see him. And I had a car by that time. It was about 3 months before he died. We drove over to the kilns. We had a very excellent time together for about an hour. Remember the conversation was very much about the Mort data and where the trees died. And he was in very good form, and as we came away, he greeted us and we went off. I don't think it was more than 3 months before he actually died.
It was a happy laugh.
Oh, he was very happy and was in quite good form, although he mentioned that he wasn't very well, but he didn't seem to have damped his spirits. And I think it was a very happy memory I had of him.
This is the Eagle and Child pub in Oxford. It is affectionately known as the Bird and Baby. Every Tuesday morning, the Inklings, a literary group which gathered round Lewis, met here for refreshments and to discuss the books they were writing. One of the senior members of the club was Dr. Robert Havard, and it was here in the Bird and Baby that our gentle host, Mrs. Winifred Redding, pulled a couple of pints for Dr. Havard and myself when we met in that same back room which was used all those years ago for the Inkling meetings.
Oh, thanks very much.
Do it overnight, and I'm retired 10 years out of the business.
Well, in that case, to Jack Lewis.
Cheers.
We've known one another for so many years. I always mean to ask you, when did you actually meet Jack?
It must have been 34, 35. I inherited a practice in Oxford, and among the patients who were handed over to me was Jack. And he duly got flu, and I went to him. And we spent about 5 minutes discussing his influenza, and we spent 25 minutes discussing Thomas Aquinas, which I was into, who I was interested in at the time. And Jack picked up the interest, and 25 minutes passed in a flash. This was my first impression of him and his way of handling his medical complaints.
Yes.
He recovered from the flu.
Yes, but he was more interested in Thomas
Much more
Aquinas
interested
than
in
flu.
Aquinas than he was in the flu.
Yes, rather typical of him.
Yes, yes.
And then
yes.
after that, how did you get to become, well, an Inkling? I know.
Well, it wasn't long after that he asked me, described to me this group of friends that meet at Magdalen on Thursday evenings, it was then, I think.
What were they like in the old days, the ones in Magdalen?
They varied a good deal. They varied very much according to who was there. They were a very varied group. They didn't all come. They varied to some extent as to what sort of dinner they'd had. Some of them had dined well, some of us had dined less well, and according to set the temperature a little bit. It varied whether they had got anything to read or not. As you know, those who were writing used to read us what they'd written. Charles Williams wrote a lot, read us a lot. Jack himself.
What do you remember Jack reading?
I remember Screwtape Letters, one of the things that stick in my mind. There was a chapter on the problem of pain, one or two I may have heard, but the Screwtape Letters really set us going. Everyone was rolling off our chairs.
Really? You didn't? Did you realize what a treat you were in for?
No, not when I joined the group, I don't think. I was taken by Jack, as everybody is when they first meet him. He's a humorous and easy chap to talk to.
I think it's Dr. Johnson who says that the size of a man's understanding might be justly measured by his mirth. To what extent do you think that would apply to Jack?
I think very well. He shared quite a bit with Dr. Johnson. He could be overbearing. He could be quite rude on occasion. He was always witty. He had a memory, a fantastic memory, that he could quote poetry by the yards, straight off the reel, without hesitation. And he could make up poetry as he went along, so you were never quite sure whether he was quoting or whether he was making it up. And he would do this deliberately on occasion, just to fox us,
yes.
you know.
Occasionally I noticed that he forgot some of his own poetry, because I once read, or quoted, one of what I thought were his best poems to him, only when I ended the poem, he said, "How ravishing." He said, "You must get me a copy of that." And I said, "But that's your poem." He said, "Oh, is it? That's jolly good, isn't it?"
Typical Jack.
Yes.
Typical Jack.
I'm sorry, you know, that he didn't write more poetry. I'm so grateful for what he did write in prose that I feel that the legacy he's left us is enough.
It is. It's a great legacy. The thing that impresses me about his prose is its clarity. Whether you agree with what he says or whether you don't, you'll understand at first reading exactly what it is he's trying to convey.
What about at the Inkling meetings themselves? Did you ever find anyone saying, "Jack, that's not clear"?
No.
I can imagine Hugo saying it. Oh, did he?
Hugo would say that, "Jack, that's nonsense." But nobody, in my memory, ever said it's not, "I don't understand."
Yes.
This is quite different from Charles. Only Jack ever said that he could understand Charles the times that I was there. But,
with respect,
Jack,
I'm afraid I don't understand Charles Williams' poetry very well.
I don't understand, I can't even understand his prose. But Jack did. And he wrote a thing on Taliesin through Logres, which is very Welsh and very Arthurian, and I couldn't make head or tail of it. But Jack congratulated him on it. He did protest a bit at times. It was difficult, but he understood it at first hearing.
What was it like? What was sort of typical Inkling's evening? We've all tried to imagine, those of us who weren't around at Magdalen at that time. What did you do?
There were anything. We used to discuss literary things quite seriously. I mean, somebody would read something, and there would be a quite serious discussion about this, brief but pointed, pros and cons, few holds barred, and then we pass on to something else. It was anything but a coterie, a literary coterie.
It's rather misunderstood today.
Well, I think there's a danger of that. There's a danger of it. And what, you see, we didn't have was a Boswell who could take down and record the conversation, because really it was the conversations that made the evening.
In discussing the Inklings with people who didn't know Jack, I often find that they seem to think that there were very mirthless evenings spent in Magdalen.
This is very far from the case. The point that one chiefly remembers about these meetings is their humor, their hilarity. For instance, the Screwtape letters. He read them, they were literary productions. We cheered and we laughed. We said how much we'd enjoyed them. To that extent, we criticized them seriously. And if there'd been anything to find fault, we'd have found fault. But the chief effect of the Screwtape letters was laughter, and how very successful a medium he managed to find for saying what he wanted to say. Original and successful.
I can never be in The Bird and the Baby without the fondest memories of Jack and of you. I hope yours haven't faded.
They've remained very bright, both in The Bird and Baby here and many other situations where very happy days I spent with them. Some of the happiest of my life, you could say, I spent with Jack. He was one of the best friends I've had.
The 7 Chronicles of Narnia, which Lewis wrote in the late 1940s and early 1950s, and now so deservedly famous as to hardly need an introduction. Much of that charm is owing to the almost equally famous illustrations by Pauline Baynes. She began illustrating the books when she was a young woman in her 20s, and she and I talked here in her cottage in Dockinfield, Surrey.
The one thing I've never understood, and perhaps an illustrator can't remember all these things, it's been some time ago, but how did you begin drawing the illustrations to the Narnian stories? Who started it?
I'd done about 5 or 6 books, one of which was Farmer Giles of Ham by Ronald Tolkien, who was a friend of Lewis's.
And I wondered if he himself had any, say, in the choice of illustrators.
Well, I did once ask him why he had picked on me. I was so inexperienced and really such a bad drawer at that time. I was just learning. The war had just gone by, and I'd skipped out on a really good solid art education. So my drawing was very rickety, and I wondered why I'd had this marvelous chance of drawing for someone who was so well known, household word C.S. Lewis. And he told me then that he had actually gone into a bookshop and asked the assistant there if she could recommend someone who could draw children and animals. I don't know whether he was just being kind to me and making me feel that I was more important than I was, or whether he'd simply heard about me from his friend Tolkien.
Looking back, you don't like your illustrations as much as I think the rest of us do you?
Well, I certainly don't like the ones for the first book, which were very stiff and awkward. But I think, just as Lewis said, I think I did improve working on the series, and I think I'm quite happy about The Last Battle.
Yes.
I like the drawings in that. I think I was beginning to draw a little bit better.
One thing I think that you and Lewis do have in common, though, is that he illustrated his own stories as a child. His figures are very stick-like, very wooden, but he nevertheless persevered. He liked to draw. But when it came to actually the stories themselves, he always said that he began with an image in his mind. He didn't begin with words, no words at all. And the Narnian stories began with a single image of a fawn carrying an umbrella and some parcels and wood, which you've drawn for us.
A very curious image for a little boy.
Yes, it is. Then after that, a lion came in, that is Aslan, and Aslan pulled the rest of the stories with him. And then only after this had happened did he realize who the lion is, the Son of God. Something that many people see and many people don't.
I didn't see it at all till I'd finished drawing The Lion, the Witch and the Wardrobe. I didn't realize that at all. But I must admit, when I was drawing Aslan going through all the awfulnesses, you remember, when he was being tortured, I was crying all the time. That bit of writing was very powerful, I think.
But then he began to see that the man in him, not the artist, but the man began to have a say. And he thought, what can I do with Aslan? Aslan seems to want to do something to these stories. And what is he doing? And what he's in fact doing is that he saw how in the real world, wherever religious topics are brought up, especially God or the sufferings of Christ, that people tend to become rather hushed as though they were discussing medical matters. And so he thought, how can one actually get people to attend to this everlasting gospel, yet at the same time not be embarrassed by it? And how does one do that but by stripping them of that stained glass appearance and letting the truth, the everlasting truth, appear in its real potency as he says, how could one steal past those watchful dragons which keep us from thinking about the things which you and Lewis have together done so well? Did Lewis give you any idea, other than the text, of what he wanted Tash to look like?
He didn't give me any idea about any of the characters, and I felt I was having it rather too much my own way, and I felt a bit awkward about this. I thought it was his book, and so when it came to Puddleglum, I thought I should query it, and wrote to him and asked if he had any idea at all as how he would like Puddleglum to look, but there again he just said, do what you like, more or less.
One thing I'm sure he was perfectly sincere in saying is that when he won the Carnegie Award for The Last Battle, he said in a letter to you, surely this is our award. And I'm certain that Lewis was perfectly sincere when he...
I'm sure he was, because he was so nice like that, but of course it wasn't so.
Those who read the book seem to have a very different feeling about that matter. Have you not received many fan letters from the readers of these books yourself?
I do get letters, and it's really wonderful, you know, after all these years, saying how much pleasure the drawings have given the child in question. And I must say it's most rewarding and very uplifting, and of course far better than any medal or any award could ever be.
Jack Lewis loved to walk, and in addition to his daily strolls, he relished long holiday walking tours with several intimate friends. He'd been sharing this particular pleasure with his friend Owen Barfield ever since they met in 1919 when they both were undergraduates. One cannot overestimate his affection for Owen Barfield, who in later life became Jack's lawyer and one of the trustees of his estate. On one occasion in 1935, Lewis came here with just Barfield on a walking tour of Derbyshire, for in many ways it was one of their favorites.
It is appreciably more like my ideal country than any I have yet seen. It is limestone mountains, which means that it has the jagged skylines and deep valleys of ordinary mountainous country, but with this important difference that owing to the paleness of the rock and the extreme clarity of the rivers, it is light instead of somber, sublime yet smiling, like the Delectable Mountains.
This is the Burley Thorn, a 15th century pub at Herdlow near Buxton. It was here that the landlady, Mrs. Lowe, cared for Owen Barfield and myself when we prepared to retrace that memorable walk. Owen, I can never drink a cup of tea without remembering what Jack said. But I poured him a cup of tea one time, and he said, you can't get a cup of tea large enough or a book long enough to suit me. I think that's typical of him.
Yes, very typical of him. He was always ready for a cup of tea at pretty well any time, and I remember he always insisted on having one after lunch.
It was your first meeting over tea?
Yes, my first meeting with him was, I suppose, either at the end of 1919 or beginning of 1920, when a common friend, Leo Baker it was, who was in my college, invited us both to tea. Undergraduates used in those days to invite each other to tea. That was my first meeting, and it was only a good deal later that I got to know him really well. And he then was living just outside Oxford with Mrs. Moore. Now, Mrs. Moore was a bit of a mystery to us because she didn't appear on the scenes. I think he wanted his position to appear as much as possible like an undergraduate with a room of his own and not connected in a domestic way with anybody. So we used to have tea with him or whatever it was, and for some reason never actually meet Mrs. Moore. But it was a little time after that, I think, when I went rather more often. Probably by that time we were both graduates. I remember I used to go sometimes later in the evening, and we would be either reading aloud or possibly talking in, I suppose, his drawing room it would be. He would suddenly say, excuse me for a few minutes, I have to go and do Mrs. Moore's jars.
Jars?
Jars. And it was some time before I understood what that meant. I don't think I ever actually asked him, but I discovered a little later that it was his name, possibly a general Irish name for hot water bottles. So he used to go and prepare hot water bottles, evidently more than one, as it was a plural, in her bed before she went to bed. And I suppose about that time, he and Havard, who used to go sometimes as well, sort of made up our minds, well, we really would try and meet this mysterious miss. So one took an opportunity, if you met her inevitably, perhaps in a passage or somewhere, you know, of getting into conversation with her. And before very long, it was much more like coming to an ordinary house and meeting a man's family as well as himself. And I can remember many very happy times. She wasn't a woman who had a great deal of conversation, in inverted commas, so to speak. I mean, she didn't know very much and wasn't much interested in what was going on in the world. I mean, she was more interested in her own affairs. But a very nice woman, and certainly both I and my wife liked her very much.
Yes, as you know, I went on living with Warnie after Jack died, and never was Mrs. Moore spoken of, except that Warnie had something extremely bitter to say about the domestic drudgery of Jack's life. I think you got quite a different picture than the one which Warnie has put about.
Yes, well, of course, my wife and I only saw her when she was entertaining, as you might say, and we didn't know what went on in the house when we weren't there. But when we read the references to her in Warnie's introduction to the letters, we were shocked. We were almost horrified, I think, at the bad impression it gave of her character. We remembered so well how she had almost pampered them, as it seemed to us. In fact, I remember my wife saying when he came away one day how she spoils those boys. That was both of them. That was after Warnie went to live with them. See. So it made the impression we had was almost the opposite of the one that Warnie gives in that introduction, and it really quite worried us.
I came to know Maureen, her daughter, now Lady Dunbar of Imprigs, and I do find her one of the most extremely likable ladies I know, and I could not believe that her mother could be such an ogre as painted by Warnie.
Yes, she does make her own ogre.
There's one thing that I feel still is misunderstood by some readers of Surprised by Joy, where Jack speaks of you as being a man who's read all the wrong books and read all the right books and got all the wrong things out of them, and as infuriating as a woman. But I notice in particular he says that a man who really looks at things from a different angle. I wonder if, in fact, of course, all this friendliness was the fact that he enjoyed the different angle from which you viewed nearly everything.
Yes, I think he did, and vice versa too. I enjoyed the different angle from which he viewed it. I think when he wrote that passage in Surprised by Joy, I won't quite say had his tongue in his cheek, but was out to have a bit of fun as well. Yes. Obviously, that reference to infuriating as a woman is obviously rather suggests that. And then he also, when he says later on that you set out to, I forget what is the phrase, to reform his views or something or other, to correct his views, and then you discover that he, forsooth, is doing the same thing to you. So, but I think, as I say, he has a bit exaggerated it. And also, when he says, this friend, i.e. I, have read all the right books and got the wrong things from them, well, I hadn't really read anything like as much, nor had I concentrated on the same kind of books that he had when we first met. All that early reading of the Norse myths and the sagas and his love of William Morris. I didn't catch up to William Morris. I don't know that I ever read any then. So it gives a slightly incorrect impression, I think, that passage, but it's also the general impression, and the contrast he makes with his first friend, as he calls him, Arthur Grieve, is quite accurate, I think.
What is it that you still miss about him, and that you perhaps find nowhere else?
What I find nowhere else, I think, is a keenness on pursuing any point of difference, or doubt to its final conclusion, and refusing to be put off by any misunderstanding of the fact that the two of you have been using words, using the same words with slightly different meanings. The kind of thing which, in conversation with other people, if I try to do, if I refuse to let the thing go, like a dog refusing to let a bone go, I get accused of being argumentative, something like that. So, in fact, I think I have a reputation among my friends for being argumentative. All I'm really concerned with is sitting at the pointed issue, but they think I'm being rather aggressive, you know, that sort of thing. Because you can't really argue keenly, eagerly, without being a bit aggressive, verbally anyhow, in our arguments. Both of us were arguing for truth and not for victory, and arguing for truth and not for comfort.
I'm in the New Quad, Brasenose College, and behind me, under the large tower, and over there the dome of the Radcliffe and the spires of St. Mary's, the Stamford Club are taking champagne before their termly dinner. We may be sure that the martlets dine very much like this, for tradition lingers in the university, and nowhere is it more strongly upheld than in college dining societies. On my left is the president, Anthony Marchington, talking with our premier guest. And after 7 courses or more, the club will retire to another room for dessert. Port, choice fruits as to the season, and talk long into the summer night, as Lewis savored.
Gentlemen, the Queen.
The Queen.
The Queen. God bless her.
I was never overshadowed.
Now that the dessert of fruit and wine have been served, the club president is introducing our guest speaker, Mr. Martin Moynihan, who was one of Lewis's students here at Oxford and has spent his life in distinguished service to the Crown as a foreign ambassador. Mr. Moynihan will recall some memories of his association with C.S. Lewis.
As your tutor said, sir, it is not settled happiness, but momentary joy which glorifies the past. Gentlemen, Martin Moynihan.
Father Hoover, Mr. President, Mr. Marchington, Mr. Senior Dean, members of the Stamford Dining Club. Lewis was a great scholar. He had at his command all the legacy of the classics, of Greece and Rome, and, be it added, of Zion. He was full of zest and relish and gusto. I'm sure, Walter, you would agree with that. He was jovial. He was a faithful, and I choose that word well, when I think of the painstaking element in all tutoring. Not only was he faithful, but he was stimulating. And all the more so because he was no more interested in his pupil or his pupils than he was in their subject and in his subject, which was English literature. Did I say English literature? English language and literature. He was a great philologist. Come in! Lewis had a voice which I cannot rival, a voice which was resonant and musical. And when you had threaded your way through the cloisters of Magdalen, crossed the lawn, up into his 18th century, book-lined, white-painted, Chesterfielded, large-windowed room, you knew that you were in for something thrilling. and sometimes something flattening. You would read your essay, and Lewis would give you his comments. You have dragged in a quotation into your essay from the Gospels. I regard that as a gross blemish. Sometimes there was just silence. You thought perhaps you had made your point, but, gentlemen, looking back, I feel it was much more likely that Lewis, in a charitable fashion, was holding his peace. But of course, Lewis was a champion of the truth. He was a champion of those who might have been pushed aside. I recollect many interesting memories of that. We would meet in his room in the evening, read with a Stupelbane in our hands, and read some old English epic. In fact, there's only one, Beowulf. But it would be the greatest pleasure. And after that, talk. I remember somebody who asked Lewis if he believed in the divine right of kings. Well, he said he didn't know much about history, but he thought the Stuarts hadn't been awfully successful. However, if you pressed the point, he said, it must go back to St. Peter and to the statement that all the powers that be are ordained of God. Whereupon our friend, whose name I remember but won't quote, said, God, I don't believe in God. And for the moment, this exploded the idea of divine right. But then he turned on Lewis and said, well, what do you mean by God? And what happened? Lewis didn't turn to waffle. He didn't turn aside. He spoke on. He said, God is a self-subsistent being, the creator of all that is, independent of all things. I was enormously impressed. It was as though you had Aquinas, Thomas Aquinas or Duns Scotus sitting there by the fireside. But, of course, there was so much more to Lewis than philosophy or dialectic. There was that inner thing, and this made Lewis a bit awesome. It was a sense of honor at first, which later became an act of faith. Lewis was very fond of quoting Coventry Patmore on this. Conversion, said Patmore, is like a man who is marching along. Suddenly, a band starts up. He is still marching along, but he is marching in tune.
There are no ordinary people. You have never talked to a mere mortal. Nations, cultures, arts, civilizations, these are mortal, and their life is to ours as the life of a gnat. But it is immortals whom we joke with, work with, marry, snub, and exploit. Immortal horrors or everlasting splendors. This does not mean that we are to be perpetually solemn. We must play, but our merriment must be of that kind, and it is, in fact, the merriest kind, which exists between people who have, from the outset, taken each other seriously. No flippancy, no superiority, no presumption. And our charity must be a real and costly love, with deep feeling for the sins in spite of which we love the sinner. No mere tolerance or indulgence which parodies love as flippancy parodies merriment. Next to the blessed sacrament itself, your neighbor is the holiest object presented to your senses. If he is your Christian neighbor, he is holy in almost the same way, for in him also Christ vere latitat. The glorifier and the glorified, glory himself is truly hidden.